Well, amid harsh operating environments, the Nigerian construction and real estate sectors contributed 20 trillion naira to the nation's gross domestic product in the first 3 quarters of 2022. According to the latest GDP report released by the National Bureau of Statistics, the construction services earned 12.9 trillion naira, while real estate contributed 7 trillion naira to the economy. The NBS calculates the sector's contribution by adding up gross output such as a sum of fees, the value of work done, commissions receivable for the services rendered, and other incomes. To discuss more on this and other contending issues in the nation's real estate sector, I'm now being joined live virtually by the Chief Executive Officer of Life Page Group, Clement Oladipupo. Thank you very much for joining me at this point.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so to start with, let's get your view on the overall assessment of the performance of the real estate sector in the past 3 quarters of this year.
All right, thank you once again for having me. The reality still remains that real estate has a lot of potential. So the report of the contributions of real estate and construction sector to the GDP of Nigeria is a reflection of the enormous potential that this particular sector has. Unfortunately, however, I think that we are still scratching the surface. We are nowhere near what the sector has capacity to deliver. And so, but it's just a reflection of the potential, the enormous potential the sector has.
You mentioned that we are nowhere near where the sector is supposed to go to. What do you think might have caused this?
All right, so,
yeah.
Okay, so let me make it abundantly clear that, yes, the real estate sector has made significant contribution to the GDP of Nigeria, but you need to understand, every Nigerian must understand this, government is still the highest spender. So when it comes to this so-called development and contributions, government is still the highest spender. And then private sector-led initiatives are still in the hands of very few who are initiating this. Now, there's so much influx of developers into the sector, and of course into the construction space. But I can tell you categorically that a bunch of these figures, 20 trillion, over 20 trillion, the last 3 quarters is just largely a government spending significantly. So,
all right. So with the harsh operating environment,
if you want to improve that sector, there has to be quite a number of things which I'm going to talk about as time goes on in this conversation.
Yeah, but with the harsh operating environment, businesses are faced with in Nigeria, especially in 2022. The real estate and construction industry contributed, like you said, 20 trillion naira to the nation's economy. Does this come as a surprise to you? And were you expecting a more significant contribution from your sector?
It's not coming to me as a surprise. If you check all other developed nations around the world, real estate plays a critical role in terms of GDP growth, right? Why is that so? Because there are many things that is tied to real estate, to infrastructural development. And so where infrastructure goes, there, commerce, there, a lot of things that growth drivers for the economy goes. So most nations prioritize that because it fits literally every other sector, including the financial sector. All right. So it's not coming to me as a surprise that we've recorded this massive growth. But again, it's important to recognize, right, that this growth is still very marginal, right? Because if you measure 20 trillion against somewhere around 19 trillion last year, and you look at it in the light of exchange rate, you realize that there hasn't really been much of growth as we have interpreted it to mean. So, and so that's also very important that we should note. I mean, it's important we note that.
Okay, so despite the growing housing deficits we face in the country, what will you say are the factors that contributed to the growth of this sector in the nation's economy?
Yeah, I mean, I just did mention that I mentioned that government is the highest spender. I also mentioned the fact that the growth is not essentially a function of, it's not a function of anything. So government in every nation is the highest spender. And in my opinion, that's really what's still playing out, because you will agree with me that the environment is really very, very harsh for most businesses, and real estate sector and construction sector is not immune to these realities. And but in terms of growth of the economy, in terms of the growth of that sector, or the contribution of that sector to the growth of the economy, I can tell you for a fact that government is still at the forefront of the spending. And if it's a spiral to the private sector, I'm certain that it can only get better in the coming months and years.
Well, with its growth of the real estate sector, do you believe that the sector is meeting the needs of Nigerians when it comes to affordable housing?
I can hardly hear you. I'm struggling
so when it comes to
really
affordable housing, is the real estate sector meeting the needs of Nigerians?
Oh, not at all. The cost of doing business is really, really, really high. I must tell you. The cost of documentation itself is high. Cost of acquiring. So affordability is still relative to whoever is buying, and to the taste, to the expectation of the individual families that is accessing. Because again, the cost of fund also is also very, very high for accessing, both on the supply end and the demand end of the economy. Until we improve the funding, the cost of finance to that sector, both essentially from the supply end of the market, and then we improve the cost of funding also from the demand end of the sector, really would not be as buoyant as it ought to be. All right. So in my opinion, we are not yet there. We are still scratching the surface. And let it also be known, it's important I put this out here, let it also be known that majority of the players we say are entering the market are not yet playing in the big league. We are still all scratching the surface. Even if we have 10,000 players coming to this sector right now, they don't have the kind of the structure, the funding, the financial structure that supports the growth of this particular sector, like what you find in other parts of the world does not yet exist, particularly because of cost of fund and then the duration and the terms of those funding, right?
So with what you're saying, will you say that this sector is lucrative?
Do I say what?
Do you still believe this sector is lucrative with the challenges you have raised up? The fact that the cost of doing business in the real estate sector is quite high, the cost of documentation and all whatnot. Do you still believe, or do you still agree that this sector is lucrative?
It's still what? Do I still
agree
believe
that the sector is lucrative? Yes.
Oh, absolutely. 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 The potential is there. The opportunities are there. Crisis creates opportunities. So there's no denial as to the fact that the market has huge potential in spite of all odds. We just need some more structured ecosystem. You see, in other parts of the world, real estate drives finance drives real estate drives tech, drives telecommunications, drives internet communications, drives electricity, drives power, drives transportation, drives literally everything, drives education, drives healthcare. So everything is interwoven until we make real estate, until we position the real estate sector, until we formulate policies, until the government formulate policies that can support real estate as a growth driver for other sectors. I'm telling you, we will not be fully maximizing the potential that it has.
So with what you have suggested, will this help us achieve the dream of low-income houses or affordable housing for all?
Absolutely. For example, if you really, how do you measure GDP of any country? Essentially, it's about the production capacity, right, of that nation vis-a-vis its dependence on importation. Now, this sector, as you see, the only thing we don't import is the land and probably documentation, probably the people. But the finishings, the materials you require for finishes are largely imported. Those who have attempted to do local production have gone belly up, largely because the value, the pricing of imported products are far cheaper and more competitive than locally produced materials. So if we really, really want to drive this development, we need to provide adequate support, for locally manufactured products. And that will invariably, because you can't tell me that this 20 trillion is based on just locally produced. How many Dangotes, for example, do we have in Nigeria? How many Boas do we have in Nigeria? Until we can reproduce 100 of Dangotes, until we can reproduce 100 of Boa, 100 of Lafarge, and the rest of them, we will not really experience the dramatic growth that we really, this nation has the potential to engineer.
So how do we do that when we largely see that we operate, despite the fact that we operate a narrow economy, we still do business in dollars? How do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we grow the sector right here?
How do we grow the sector?
How do we grow the sector here? How do we grow the value chain that connects with the sector, the construction sector, the building materials, and all of that, despite the fact that we also do business, while doing business with the Naira, we do business in dollars as well? And how do we develop locally?
Yeah, so these are the reasons why government has a critical role to play in the development of not only real estate or construction sector, literally all the other sectors are heavily, this country is heavily import dependent. And it is because we've literally crippled all the relevant sectors, all the people who have made attempts to do local production, more or less been crippled when power is not intact, when the roads leading to their sites are not good, when, all of these things has its own impact. It has its impact on the cost of production and ultimately the cost of the market price. All right. So if the people who import, right, are far cheaper, it's cheaper to import than to produce here. Why should somebody continue to produce here? The point we're trying to make is government needs to invest more and provide support, right, for this sector. Because you see, every house that is built, every building that you see that is going up is providing at least 20 to 25 jobs for different families, 20 to 25 jobs, right? So imagine the impact that would have if we have 25 million housing developments going on around the nation. It would directly impact on people and the economy. So if you ask me what must be done, it still comes back to government. So as the 2023 election is fast approaching, we should be watching out for the policy of the manifesto of the various candidates within the state governments, within the executive government, what's their manifesto, and see who is really favoring this development.
Now, earlier you mentioned about the policy framework of candidates and aspirants at this point, especially as we go into the elections next year. Most times you see people campaigning, they most likely, or most times, have little or nothing to say about their plans for the real estate sector. What exactly should we look out for in terms of policy framework?
Right. Now, let me give you a practical example of something we should look out for. I am not only interested in any government who says they will fix road, but will not make documentation a smoother process. We need to digitize. I know Lagos State government is already doing some sort of work in that respect. Other state governments need to catch up as well. And we need to, eliminate middlemen, right? People should be able to verify title documents, right, from the click of a button, right? This is the way it works in most other parts of the world, right? So when you find things like these happen, it stimulates growth. Then revenue will also improve because people really don't mind paying a lot more for services rendered, other than making so much payments and then you hardly get your documents out as soon as it should. Because whether you like it or not, all these things spiral into, for a business that has a 5 or 10 billion naira project and needs to access funding, the funder or financier needs some kind of documentation, right? But if you have applied for documents, for example, and it's taking you forever to get that out, it will take forever also to access such kind of funding. The other part we also need to pay attention to is also in the area of funding and the funding structure that we have currently in our mortgage system. Mortgage should not only service the demand end of the market. In my opinion, it should also service the supply end, and it should be more long-term, because real estate is a long-term investment vehicle, and there will be a mismatch of funds if the long-term fund or a short-term fund is being used to finance long-term projects. And so we need the cost to be fully reviewed. It will favor the demand end of the market, because ultimately people can spread their payments over a longer period of time, and then the so-called affordability can be because can be made, properties and homes can be made affordable for families and individuals when they have longer time to spread their payments, and then they can access funding. All right. So the same thing goes for developers, right? The more available and accessible funding and the cost of funding is, the better it will be for the entire value chain within the industry.
All right, finally, before we let you go,
the market should be people should be looking out for.
All right, so finally, before we let you go, what's your projection for the sector in the coming year, and also the quarter, your projection for quarter 4 of 2022?
So Q4 in the real estate space, a lot of funding will be coming in, particularly from diaspora. Most Nigerians will be flowing into the country to make more investments. So I already project that this Q4 is already growing significantly, even much more than what we've seen, and it will even do a lot better. And for the coming year, being an election year and being a year when a new government will be installed, I see sporadic growth. That's what I see, but it will still be marginal compared to what we will see in the coming years.
All right, thank you very much, Clement Oladipupo, for talking to us on this, of course, giving us your thoughts, which was quite stimulating. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.